So now we have the Q&A session. So these are all the Q's in here. I have to supply all the A's. So we'll see what happens. Okay, so you speak of sexual misconduct. How is this defined within Buddhism? And does this mean that some or certain sexual practices are acceptable? Okay, what does it mean? So basically, the Buddhist idea of sexual misconduct is any kind of sexual relations that are hurtful to someone else, right? So I just mentioned pedophilia this morning is an obvious case of sexual misconduct. But more generally, the type of sexual misconduct we talk about would be like being unfaithful to a partner, right? If you're unfaithful to a partner, it causes a lot of suffering, a lot of hurt. That is part of what is meant by sexual misconduct here. So any kind of sexual relation which hurts somebody else is essentially what is meant by this. Buddhism doesn't really have any problem with homosexuality or anything like that, at least not from the suttas. The Buddha didn't say anything about that, so that's not really an issue from a Buddhist point of view. Okay, straightforward. Okay. Dear Ajahn, some people can be very virtuous and generous, but often forget about themselves, despite others telling them to also care for themselves. What would be your advice to those people and how to relate to them with metta? Okay. If you are very virtuous and very generous in a good way, if you are practicing virtue because you really are selfless in the higher sense of the word, that you're forgetting about yourself because simply you enjoy giving so much, then it's not an issue. You can forget about yourself. Actually, forgetting about yourself in a certain way, in the sense that you don't worry about the results of the generosity, you don't worry about the results of your good actions, that's actually the best way to be generous, that particular way. But perhaps what you mean here is being virtuous and generous and not really looking after yourself. Maybe that's what you mean here, that you are too generous and you don't really, you're not actually perhaps doing it in the right way. Perhaps you're doing it without really thinking about yourself in the right sense. And that can be a problem if you are generous perhaps slightly for the wrong reasons, or you're virtuous slightly for the wrong reasons. And you actually kind of damage yourself in the process, and of course then you have to be careful. So that is where the problem can arise. So in those situations, you just have to, I suppose, to tell these people that the purpose of the spiritual path is to find happiness in the world, right? And that happiness is for yourself and for others. And it's not good to do anything which damages yourself. It's kind of a misguided generosity if you do generosity and you damage yourself in the process. One of the things that the Buddha always says in the suttas, which are the basis for morality, the basis for morality is anything which causes happiness for yourself and happiness for others, right? And in a sense, that is a very beautiful way of defining what is a spiritual act as compared to what you might call a worldly act. A spiritual act is one which creates happiness for yourself and for others and for yourself, not for one or the other. So if you're completely concerned about others and you think, doesn't matter what happens to me, then that is a lack of balance there, and it's not the right way of thinking. You have to make sure that you also benefit from this. And the best way of benefiting from generosity and virtue is, in a sense, to actually forget about yourself, but forget about yourself in a good way, not to worrying about the result, not to worry about the consequences of your action, just doing it because it feels good to be kind. And if you do it that way, then you are practicing the right way here. Okay. Okay, so how do you reconcile gold and jewel-encrusted representations of the Buddha, knowledge with the Buddhist view of wealth? Is it this one here, is it? It's not, I think the one in the hall is even worse. Well, this is not really, it's not actually gold, it's representation, that is true. It looks like gold. It's actually fairly cheap, I think. And the one in the hall, I think, is even cheaper. It actually looks quite cheap, to be quite honest with you. That's my reckoning anyway. It doesn't look very expensive. So it is true, and I think that it is actually a very unfortunate thing that in Buddhism we have come to the point where a lot of money is spent on things which the Buddha probably wouldn't really have agreed with. A lot of money is spent on massive Buddha statues. A lot of money is spent on all kind of things which have no real benefit for people. As you say, sometimes it is real gold. This is actually just fake stuff. Sometimes it is real gold, right? And this money is spent in this way, and it is a shame. And I don't think the Buddha himself would actually have accepted that. The reason that we have this particular Buddha statue over here, this was given as a gift to us from the World Fellowship of Buddhists in Thailand. They brought it over. And sometimes you just, sometimes what can you do? This is like the tradition. So sometimes you just have to go with the flow. It's very hard sometimes to say no to a gift when somebody gives you a beautiful gift like that. It's meant as an act of friendliness, right? Okay, so you accept it in that way. If it was real gold, we might have actually rejected it. But generally, I agree with your point, and I would have been much happier if in the world we spent the money that actually Buddhism collects from all kinds of people in a wiser way. I would have personally feel much happier about that. But unfortunately, that is often not the case. If you look at Bodhinyana Monastery just across the road, it is quite a simple monastery. We don't have a gold Buddha statue there in the main hall. The dwellings of the monks are very simple and basic. Ajahn Brahm even lives in a very simple cave at the monastery. You will find that the vast majority of people in his position have a much more fancy dwelling place than he has. So we keep things very simple over there, and I think that's good. I think that's the way it should be, and I think that's very nice to do that. But remember that when we do that at Bodhinyana Monastery, we're going actually against the flow of a lot of how Buddhism is practiced around the world. A lot of Buddhist monastics do not become monastics because they want to practice the Dhamma, right? The majority of Buddhist monastics are like professionals. They do this to provide teachings or sometimes advice or guidance to people, sometimes to act as doctors or school teachers or whatever. This is very, very often how Buddhist monastics have ended up. And it's not so much their fault. It's just that society has somehow got them into that position. And that's what has happened. So it's great to have the possibility of kind of moving towards a more pure form of monasticism again. I think it's very important to take that into account. But sometimes you're compromised, right? It's not always easy to go against the flow. Sometimes you have to find compromises, kind of halfway houses. It can be very difficult. So sometimes you have to accept a Buddha statue like this. Sometimes it's very hard to avoid. Okay. Next one. Dear Ajahn, can you please comment on which suttas in the canon may be spurious and why? Also, in reference to translations, which words do you think Bhikkhu Bodhi could have translated more accurately, aside from concentration, stillness? Okay. What words could he have translated more accurately apart from that one? Okay. Well, let's first of all look at the canon. Which suttas might be spurious and why? Generally speaking, the way I would recommend you approach the Pali Canon, the Pali Canon is the canon that is the suttas or the discourse of the Buddha preserved in the Pali language, which are used in Theravada Buddhism. And the most basic teachings there, they're considered of five collections called Nikayas. And you have the long discourses, the middle-length discourses, the connected discourses, the numerical discourses, and then you have the Khuddaka Nikaya, which means like the short collection. Actually, the short collection is the biggest one in the whole Pali Canon. So it shows you how things kind of get distorted over time, right? I think it started off short and it grew and grew and grew and became very big after a while. So if you want to find the word of the Buddha, the best thing then is to go to the four main Nikayas: long discourses, medium, connected, and numerical discourses. And if you read those suttas, if you want to be reasonably sure that what you have is the word of the Buddha, then look at those suttas that occur again and again, the teachings you see again and again in those four Nikayas. that is most likely to be the true teachings of the Buddha. If something maybe occurs once or twice, it may be the result perhaps of a fault or having come down in the wrong way. But if something exists in many different places and they have come down through many different traditions, reciter traditions, different schools, etc., it is very, very likely that that actually is the word of the Buddha. So instead of picking out specific suttas that might be spurious, think like that. Think of what is the main word in this Pali Canon. Then you can be fairly, almost absolutely sure that that actually goes back to the Buddha. And that's how I see that one. Okay, so which words by Bhikkhu Bodhi could be translated more accurately? Okay. I think that as a translator, you are often, you're often trapped by conventions, by the way things have been translated in the past, right? So often it's difficult to make changes. You can't make too many changes, otherwise people don't understand what's going on. But one of the words that I would have personally liked to see translated differently is the word vipassana. The word vipassana is often translated as insight, right? To me, insight is no different from wisdom. Panya is often translated as wisdom, because insight means you have insight into something. It means you understand something. So you have wisdom about something, right? To me, there is very little distinction between insight and wisdom. And yet in the suttas, vipassana and panya, the two words that represent here insight and wisdom, are used very differently. Panya is actual wisdom. Vipassana is something that leads up to wisdom. The word vipassana is actually derived from the word passati, which means to see. So it actually means something like seeing. And the V prefix can have many different meanings. But I think the best translation, and it's sometimes translated as this in German, is like clear seeing something clearly, seeing something without distortion. It's the kind of seeing that happens when the defilements start to come down. That is what vipassana basically is about, seeing things clearly. That makes more sense to me, because vipassana is a very broad term that you can see almost coming along, all the way along the path. Insight is a specific result that happens as a consequence of meditation, whereas vipassana is one of those things, is something that you develop, it's not a specific result, it's a quality of the mind that develops over time. Samatha and vipassana go together, calm and clear seeing. They are qualities that gradually grow. They're not referring to specific insights. Right? So that is how I would understand the word vipassana. I'm sure that other arguments can be made for that. Are there any other terms that might be translated differently, important terms? There is another term which could perhaps be translated differently, and that is the term nibbida. Nibbida is, I was reading out this sequence yesterday, what happens in meditation practice, whereby you start off with virtue, you go to happiness, and eventually you get samadhi, and then you see things as they actually are. And then when you see things as they actually are, you get to this thing called nibbida. And nibbida is this feeling of like you are almost like rejecting something, right? It's a rejection in a sense. And what is happening here? Remember that what we're doing here, when we see things as they actually are, we are seeing often suffering, right? Suffering is one of the characteristics of existence. And when you see suffering in something, when you see that a certain thing is unpleasant, you reject it. And it's a bit like, you can imagine yourself if you are in a house and you walk around and by accident you touch something which is very hot, like a hot plate or something. You don't have to think, should I remove my hand from this hot plate? You don't have to think, well, is this a good idea to keep my hand here or not? You don't have to think like that, right? It's an automatic reaction. You withdraw it straight away. And it's a similar kind of thing when you actually see things as they actually are. When you see that something is suffering, the mind withdraws. It's like it rejects that thing because it's suffering, right? So one way of translating nibbida is like rejection or being kind of repelled by something. You are repelled, you kind of pull back, right? That's one way. Bhikkhu Bodhi has translated as disenchantment, and I think it might be perhaps too weak a term in that context. So there are a few suggestions, but these are my preferences, and everybody has their preference, unfortunately. So there's often no end to these kind of discussions. Anything else? Probably, but I can't think of it right now. So, okay. Next one. Do the different Buddhist groups all teach the same thing? And do they all respect the Dalai Lama? Okay, do they all teach the same thing? Sort of, perhaps. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. What is interesting is that some of the very basic teachings of the Buddha are pretty much the same across all forms of Buddhism. And one of the things that I respect about the Dalai Lama, for example, is that when I listen to him, he often teaches very simple, basic Buddhist teachings. And a large part of the things that he teaches I would agree with almost completely, and I wouldn't have much differences with that. He teaches mindfulness of the breath, right? Watching the breath, that's what we teach here. He teaches compassion, he teaches all the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, all the basic things that everyone else in Buddhism also teaches. Sometimes there are divergences, but instead of focusing, I think, on those divergences that we see, which are often philosophical differences or differences in way of thinking, when we think about those differences and we start to argue about differences, that's when we feel that we belong to different groups. But when you look at how people actually practice the Buddhist path, if you look at somebody who is a Mahayana Buddhist and compare them to a Theravada Buddhist or compare them to a Tibetan Buddhist, and you see what they actually do, pretty much they all do the same thing, right? They all want to be kind, they all want to live a virtuous life, they all want to be compassionate, they all want to be wise. So when you look at what we do, often that's when you see the unity in Buddhism. When you start discussing philosophy, that's when you start to see the differences. So what really matters, the philosophy or what we do? And I think what we do probably matters much more in the end. If we do the same thing, we're practicing the same path. Do all Buddhists respect the Dalai Lama? I suppose, yeah, more or less. All Tibetan Buddhists probably respect him more than Theravada Buddhists, right? Because we're a slightly different lineage. You might as well, what about Christians? Do they respect Dalai Lama? Probably do. They probably do as well, right? Because he's a good person. Sometimes it's more about if you have a virtuous person, everybody respects a virtuous person. Do I respect the Dalai Lama in the sense that I think that he is like an awakened being, anything like that? In that case, I would probably be more, I can't say anything definite about that, but I probably would be more, not probably as convinced as maybe some Tibetan Buddhist would be about that kind of thing. Simply because if you are a political leader of a whole nation, it's very hard to combine political leadership also with deep spiritual realization, right? It's very difficult to get those two things together. Deep spiritual realization usually comes from solitude, from meditation, putting in years of effort into those things. That's where it comes from. It's more likely to find that in a monk or a nun living somewhere far away in a kuti somewhere. That's where you're more likely to find those things than in somebody who is very enmeshed in worldly matters. Okay, next one. Do you consider the appreciation of nature, art, and music to be an indulgence of the senses or sensual pleasure? Okay, it depends how you do it, right? It depends. These things are all depending on context and what you do. Certainly, the appreciation of nature as such is not usually a problem because nature is often quite peaceful, is often quite beautiful. And you find in the suttas, you find that some of the enlightened monks and awakened nuns and monks, they actually appreciated nature. So for them, there was no problem. So certainly appreciating nature does not seem to be a major issue. In fact, it's good to appreciate nature because by appreciating nature, it often tends to draw you away from the city, right? And then you can come here and you can enjoy staying here. You can become a monk, you might enjoy staying in the forest, or become a nun and enjoy staying by yourself. If you don't like nature, it's going to be hard living in a little hut in the forest by yourself. So it's very useful to appreciate nature. Art and music, yes, I think to some extent these things are okay. Remember that it's all about how you use these things, right? So if you come back home, for example, after a long and very stressful day, and then you put on some nice music that you like, maybe you listen to some chanting or whatever else, and if it is to help you to calm down, if it makes you feel more relaxed, then of course it is useful, right? So you have to look at how it affects you. On the other hand, if it is a sensory indulgence, then of course you will feel that your mindfulness starts to dissipate. If it helps you to increase your mindfulness, great. But if it is indulgence, your mindfulness actually declines. You're less able to be in the present moment. You're more like drawn in to the beauty of the art or the music, and you lose your ability to watch yourself and to be present right here and right now. So it's all about how you use it. Everything in Buddhism is very pragmatic. How do these things actually work for you? So look at it that way. And remember that it's not about just trying to cut out sensual pleasures. If you try to cut off sensual pleasures in life and say, right, I'm going to be a real Buddhist, I'm not going to mess around anymore, you're just going to suffer, right? It's going to become too difficult. So don't think that sensual pleasures are necessarily a bad thing. They're often a necessary thing. It's not something you can just kind of throw out the window. And the Buddha even said it's not if you look at the things which are considered obstacles to the Buddhist path, then sensuality is much less of an obstacle than anger. So what you do is you start practicing. And as you practice and you see how these things affect your mind, there's like a natural movement there. You start to understand the problems that arise from too much indulgence. And when you understand the problems that arise, it's easy to give it up, right? It just happens by itself. You don't have to worry about it. It's a natural movement of the mind away from those things that are obstacles to something which is much more beautiful than what you had before. This is the point, right? The point is not giving up something and not getting anything in return. The point is giving up something to get much more in return. That's the whole purpose here. And you understand that sensuality at some point becomes an obstacle for getting something which is far more beautiful, far more profound, far more peaceful, far more happy. So why on earth would you want to block yourself from getting something which is just so much more beautiful than what you had before? It doesn't make any sense, right? But you have to see that for yourself. And when you see that for yourself, it just happens pretty much automatically. Yes? Okay. So, next one. Dear Ajahn, if the non-returner and the enlightened being will not be reborn again, what is the difference between these two? Thank you. Okay, so the non-returner and the enlightened being will not be reborn again. Well, the non-returner actually is reborn. It's just that they're not reborn in the human realm, right? This is according to the Buddhist ideas. They go on to the realms for those people who have very deep meditation, kind of the jhana realms. That's where you get reborn as a non-returner. Whereas an arahat, the fully awakened being, they just, once they end their life, that's it, no more rebirth. So that is the difference between the two, right? Okay. Okay, reincarnation question here. On the earth today, there are so many more people than 1,000 years ago. So where do all these extra people get reincarnated from? There's a big smiley face on the bottom here. Okay, that's good. So, the answer to that is that in the Buddhist idea of the universe, they're not just people, they're other beings as well. All kinds of beings. There are animals, for example, and we share our existence with the animals. Animals get reincarnated, they die, etc., get reborn. According to Buddhism, they're also kind of ghost realms, right? They are divine beings according to Buddhism. They're just like us, except that they have a bit more happiness, a bit more power, etc. So if you get reborn as a divine being, suddenly you find, wow, I'm still here, but now I have all this happiness and all these other things which I didn't have before. That's really the only difference. So there's still you, it's just as a different type of person. That's where they all come from. So that's why it is possible to have so many beings, people today. Okay? Next one. How would you describe true love? What to do when the person whom you love hurts you? Okay, so true love is like unattached love, right? Love where there's no craving, love where there's no desire, the love which you have for anyone else, not like romantic love, not love you have for the opposite gender, but love you can have even for someone of your own gender. Usually actually someone of your own gender, because if you have a sense of metta, or friendliness, or goodwill towards someone of your own gender, except if you are gay, of course, but if you're not gay, then that will be a very pure form, because there's not that desire there for a relationship, right? So true love is the sense of goodwill that you have towards somebody else, regardless of who they are, regardless of what they do. This is the beauty of true love. So it is often the love you have for like a stranger, right? If you're able to have goodwill towards someone who's a complete stranger, it means that you have no vested interest with that person. You don't expect anything in return from them. You don't expect them to be kind back. You don't expect them to do anything for you. And because you don't expect anything from them, it's a very pure form of metta, very pure form of goodwill and love. So that is kind of pure kind of love. And that is why when you say the person whom you love, you're already talking about a romantic relationship when you put it in that way, right? That is already an attachment there. There's already a craving there. There's already a vested interest in that type of love. So that's the reason why they can hurt you. They can hurt you precisely because you have a vested interest in that relationship. If you love a stranger, if you have pure goodwill towards a stranger, it doesn't matter what they do, right? You have no vested interest. It doesn't matter if they do something bad, because you can just say, I will never see you again anyway. It doesn't matter. So this is why you get hurt. So what do you have to do if someone who you love hurts you, is to understand that this is the nature of desire. This is the nature of attachment. When you are attached to someone, you can expect that this will happen. Sooner or later, if you love someone romantically, you will be hurt by that. Either in this life, when they either decide they don't want to be together with you anymore, they leave you, or they cheat on you, or eventually, at the very latest, when you die, right? If you love someone very strongly, even if you have the most perfect relationship in the world, which are very rare, by the way, but even if you have the most perfect relationship, eventually it has to disappear. Eventually it will have to be dissolved, because somebody is going to have to die, right? So this is the problem with attachment. This is the problem with craving. It always has to end one way or another with pain. And this is part of the reason why you try to seek a higher kind of love, the love which does not have that sense of attachment there. So think about that. It's a challenging idea for many people to think like that, but reflect on it. It doesn't mean that you reject relationships straight away. It just means that you start to think slightly differently, and you start to value things in a slightly different way. That's what that really means. Okay. Why are there different Buddha statues, e.g. happy Buddhas, laughing Buddhas, and the one you display here? So why are there different types of Buddha statues? The reason for that is because Buddhism is so vast. There are so many different traditions, there are so many different cultures in which there are Buddhism. It existed for 2,500 years. People have so many different ideas about what Buddhist teachings are. It would be a miracle if there weren't a vast array of different Buddha statues. Just the history of Buddhism is so complex and so long, and so many different things going on, that it is very natural this is to happen. But just to give you some idea, this type of Buddha statue you see here is a Thai kind of Buddha statue. I think I'm not really an expert on Buddhist art, but I think this is a Thai Buddha statue, and it's fairly similar to the Buddha statues you will see in places like Sri Lanka and Burma and the whole Theravada world. Reasonably similar. There are few differences in these things. The laughing Buddha, or the happy Buddha, is a Chinese type of Buddha statue, and you find it in the Chinese culture. And actually, it's not actually a Buddha statue at all. The laughing Buddha is actually a future Buddha, Maitreya Buddha. It's called Milöfo in Chinese. And Milöfo is a word for Maitreya Buddha. So it is basically a future Buddha. So this is a bodhisattva, somebody who's going to become a Buddha in the future. So it's a completely different way of thinking about the Buddha's teachings. So, and also, there is a very strong cultural component there, right? In China, just like anywhere else around the world, in the old days, when food was much more scarce, etc., a happy person was often a fat, big person who was able to eat a lot, right? These days, everybody wants to be thin, but there was a time when everybody wanted to be fat because that showed you were prosperous and you were very well off by being fat. So that's why you had the laughing Buddha, very happy, very fat, and had everything good in the world. That was the idea behind that. So it's also a cultural thing at the same time. So all of these things kind of come in together there. In the very beginning, in the very early times of Buddhism, there were actually no Buddha statues at all. After the Buddha, for the first, say, 300 or 400 years, there were no Buddha statues. And the Buddha, or his awakening, was represented by symbols instead. So you had the Dhammacakka, the famous wheel of the Dhamma with 8 spokes, right? Or you had the empty seat. The empty seat was a symbol of awakening. The Buddha would have sat there, was an empty seat. Or the tree of awakening is another one. Or you had the stupa, which symbolizes the Buddha's passing away. So you had all the symbols of the Buddha, but not the Buddha himself. That was not part of the Indian way of depicting things, or depicting a person. But then later on, one of the theories is that it was under the influence of Greek art, because the Greek art existed in the northwest of India, and that is where possibly they started to depict the Buddha in a figure in human form. And it's interesting when you see some of those Buddha statues from the northwest of India. They have it's wearing a toga, right? A toga is of course the Greek kind of costume people would wear. And you see the Buddha in this toga costume. So it looks like a kind of half Greek, half Indian. Not quite sure what this person is. Very interesting. So that is where this idea of Buddha statues came in the first place. Remember, the Buddha actually said, and this is also quite an interesting point, the Buddha says, don't worry about me, don't worry about this physical body of mine. You shouldn't worship the physical body. There's a famous case where a monk is sick and is about to pass away, and he asks if he can see the Buddha for a last time. And the Buddha says to him, why on earth do you want to see this physical body for? This is not what I represent. What I represent is the qualities that I have realized, right? Peace, happiness, awakening, freedom from suffering. That is what the real Dhamma is. The Dhamma is not in a physical form. And of course now, 2,500 years, that's what we do. We often tend to, we bow down to these physical representations of the Buddha. So please, when we do that, remember that what you're really bowing down to is not this, this piece of metal, if you like. That's not what you're bowing down to. What you're bowing down to is the qualities of the Buddha. The Buddha said, this is what the Buddha is. The Buddha is the Dhamma. He is the teaching. He is the realization. He is the compassion, the peace, the wisdom, the understanding. That's what you bow down to. So when you bow down to that, it sort of makes sense, right? You're bowing down to something truly worthy of respect. It's quite easy to bow down to compassion and virtue because it makes sense. These are beautiful qualities. These are things you actually can respect in that way. So when you think like that, it makes it much easier. And it's a beautiful thing to bow down to something like that. It actually feels good after a while. It feels good inside. It feels like something that is right to do. So test it out for yourself and see what happens. Okay, so, dear Ajahn Brahmali, this is not a question, but a comment. This is the most insightful and joyful retreat I have ever attended. Thank you so much. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May we all attain Nirvana in this life, especially you. How wonderful to see the true Sangha of our Lord Buddha here in Australia. All best wishes. That's a very nice little note, isn't it? So, good. I'm very happy that you are happy, and you are happy that I'm happy. That's really great, isn't it? We're all happy for each other. Sort of makes things grow in a nice way. So, now back to a question again. I accept your explainer that Ananda says that friends are not 50% of the spiritual life, but 100%. And yet, on reading Venerable Dhammavuddotthero, he quotes from studying original text. The Buddha explained, let the Sutta Vinaya be your ultimate guide, even if a close friend should advise one, yet the Sutta Vinaya, another thing, wish and live him well, saying the Sutta Vinaya is the final guide. Okay, so I guess the point here is that the final guide is the suttas and the Vinaya, and I think that is precisely right, what you're saying there. That is exactly correct. When the Buddha passes away, he says you shouldn't have another teacher. I am your teacher. When I pass away, you are not bereft, you're not without a teacher. Your teacher from now on will be the Dhamma, right? And the Vinaya. In other words, the Vinaya is like the conduct, and the Dhamma are the teachings of the Buddha. So the teachings of the Buddha is what is your guide after I pass away, says the Buddha. But that doesn't mean that spiritual friendship is not 100% of the spiritual life, because the suttas are your spiritual friend, right? This is the word of the Buddha. By reading the sutta, you're taking the Buddha as your spiritual friend in a sense. So this is part of spiritual friendship. And of course, because the Buddha has passed away, sometimes you need a little bit more than that. You also need the presence of someone who actually shows you that these things are possible. So you have the suttas, but you also have the living example at the same time. Those two coming together then becomes your spiritual friendship, your kalyana mitta in this life. But it's also broader than that, right? When you come on retreat like this, everyone is supporting everyone else. Everyone is helping out, and we're all kind of working together in a sense. So in a way, we're all our kalyana mittas. And in daily life, in the ordinary life, sometimes you have to be careful. It is difficult sometimes when you are around a lot of people who don't think like you, who may be negative or fault-finding, or may have very different ideas about what life is like. Then sometimes you need to remind yourself of the Buddha's teachings. You need to go and listen to a talk. You need to go to have a chat with a Buddhist friend to remind yourself what Buddhism is about. So spiritual friendship is quite broad. There's many different levels of it. The Buddha is like number one, but you can broaden it out to include much more than that. But in the end, it's everything that pushes you in the right direction, everything that moves you towards happiness, less suffering, towards Nibbana ultimately. All that is good spiritual friendship. Anything that takes you away from that is bad spiritual friendship, right? Anything that moves in the right direction is the good stuff. Okay. Dear Ajahn, when you say that Tathagata's words are the best, what of he approves of a disciple? Okay, what of when he approves of a disciple who is present? Okay, yes, I think that is a good point. So often you find that in the suttas, the Buddha will sometimes give a talk, but sometimes it will be one of the disciples of the Buddha who gives a talk. And at the end of the talk, the Buddha will say, Sadhu, if anybody had asked me that question, I would have answered in exactly the same way. Sometimes the Buddha says that. And yes, sometimes that will indeed be, then I think a tantamount to saying that that is the word of the Buddha. Occasionally, it seems to me that those words might have been put in there afterwards, that the Buddha says that kind of thing. Occasionally it looks a little bit like that. It is very hard to judge, but to judge that you have to do like all kinds of studies of the suttas to find out whether that might be the case or not. The more you understand, the more you read the suttas, the more understand you have the whole kind of genre, if you like, of these kind of texts, the more you understand what might be a later addition and what might not be. But it takes quite a bit of study sometimes. But essentially, I think you're right, and you don't have to worry too much about that. But again, the point here, as I mentioned before, the most important point is it a sutta which occurs again and again? Is it a type of teaching that you see across the suttas, across the board? Then you can feel very certain that this is an original teaching. If it is a rare teaching, then if it is spoken by the Buddha or spoken by a disciple, regardless, it's going to be less reliable. Okay. Okay, so, dear Venerable Sir, what does placidity of the mind mean? Thank you. Okay, placidity of the mind. What is the Pali word here? I think it's pasada or something like that. I think it is. I can't remember now what the Pali is. Sometimes you have to go back to the Pali, right? If you look at the English translation, sometimes you're not 100% sure what it actually means. I think it means pasada. And pasada is a state of mind where the mind is kind of peaceful, where the mind is relaxed, when you have a sense of confidence, when you have a sense of ease, and things are kind of going very smoothly. And in this particular context, it seems to mean the mind where there is very little hindrances in the mind. In other words, you don't have any strong desires, you don't have any strong ill will, and the mind is basically at ease. You're in the present moment, you have good mindfulness, and you have a sense of ease in the present moment. That seems to me essentially what is meant by this right here. Placidity of the mind, pasada. Yeah, I think that is the main implication of the term, that basically the hindrances are not there. Okay, is there a point when someone's bad behavior is compromising to yourself? Given that keeping company with noble friends is part of the path, at what point might it be best to go away? Yes, I would say that is probably true, that someone's bad behavior can sometimes be compromising to oneself. It depends, of course, a little bit on what kind of bad behavior it is, depends on all kind of circumstances. I have certainly found in my life that sometimes there are difficult people around, people with difficult character, right? And people you don't get along with perhaps, but perhaps sometimes the behavior might be a little bit bad as well. But sometimes if you find it hard to get along with somebody, very often, instead of actually rejecting that person and trying to kind of move away or go somewhere else, sometimes it's very useful to try to change your perception, your understanding of what that person is like. I was talking about that this morning when about basically trying to understand someone's background, right? That somebody has, for example, a very difficult background, and because they have a difficult background, they have become a difficult person in this life. So once you understand that, once you look at the background, your attitude of that person actually changes. You start to have more compassion. You don't actually get upset by their conduct anymore, because you understand that the way they are is a consequence of all these difficulties in the past. So this is a great way of trying to change your attitude, change your perception, change your thinking. And you, every one of us, will grow so much by being able to change that attitude. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do. This is part of the growth in the Dhamma, to change our perceptions. In fact, there are places where the Buddha says that only through understanding perception, which perceptions lead to growth, which perceptions lead to kind of flatness, no movement, staying steady, which perceptions lead to decline, and which perceptions lead to kind of, he says, penetration, means penetration into the deep insights. Just by understanding perception, that's enough for you to become an Arya and practice this path properly. So this development of perception, understanding which perceptions are useful, which perceptions are not useful, this is a very fundamental part of the practice. So sometimes when someone is difficult, it is an opportunity for you to learn to look at things differently. There are occasions, however, where that even if you have the right perception, it may turn out that it still has a detrimental impact on you, and that is true. And you also have to know the limit. Sometimes you can only take so much, right? If you are too close to someone who is very difficult, like you have someone in the family, for example, you have to see them every day. Sometimes it just gets too much, and you need to withdraw, and you need to pull out. You need to come here to Jhana Grove and have a retreat to get away a little bit, so as to get a neutral view of that person again. And then you can re-establish perhaps that compassion and kindness. So it is both. The answer is, sometimes you're right, you have to withdraw a bit, sometimes you have to withdraw completely, sometimes you have to work on your perception, work on your own way of thinking. It all depends on the situation, and there is no absolute answer to these kind of things, and you basically have to decide for yourself what is the right thing to do. Okay, is it possible to remain in a relationship with a family member who is angry, aggressive, always trying to dominate and push the buttons and annoy you, to get a negative response if you ignore the bad behavior? Okay, so I guess it depends on, it depends all on the situation, right? There is no fixed answer to these kind of things. Sometimes, as I said before, it may be right to end the relationship. It depends on your responsibility, right? If it is a child, you can't just chuck the child out on the street. You have a certain responsibility there. Or if it is a parent who you find very difficult, again, you have a certain degree of responsibility towards your parents as well. However, if it is somebody who you are married to, for example, or just a romantic relationship, of course, that makes it much easier to untie the knot and to go your own way, so to speak. So it all depends on the situation, but always in these kind of things, it is always useful at least to try for a while and see if you can change your reaction. If you can change your reaction, you learn so much from that. You learn so much by trying to understand, by trying to develop compassion, by trying to develop a different view of the situation. You can learn so much from that. And that is always the first thing one should try to do. And if you find that you still doesn't work, if you find that you're kind of drowning in your own emotions because the relationship is just too much for you to handle, then perhaps the second thing to do is then to withdraw a little bit, right? To pull back, to be around that person a little bit less, to come here, to go to the Buddha site in Olamara, to do things where you get a bit more perspective on life, and in particular that relationship specifically. And ultimately, if it still is too difficult, then perhaps you have to withdraw even more, to the point where perhaps you have to kind of abandon some of the closeness in that relationship, right? Not have the same close relationship you had before. But what you will find is that there comes a point when you reach a balance again. And when you reach that balance, you will start to see that now you have the ability to be compassionate, even to this very difficult person. Once you get enough room, sometimes it may take a lot of room, but once you have enough room, you find your ability gets re-established to be kind and compassionate to this person. It's like sometimes people have difficult children or difficult parents. But there comes a point when you get enough distance from your parents when you grow up, that suddenly you can see them in a different light, right? And you can start to forgive them for any shortcomings. And you can see that perhaps they weren't as bad after all as you thought, right? This is what happened to me. When I grew up, I was just a teenager like everyone else and had, all arguing with my parents and all these kind of things. But actually, when I think back now, I think my parents were great. They were wonderful people. Difficult to have, parents who did so many good things for me, and who had so much kindness and who allowed me to become a monk. I mean, how many parents allow you to become a monk? It's a difficult thing to give up your son to become a monk. So, and of course, that is what we see afterwards when we get a bit more distance. And this is the ideal way of dealing with any kind of relationship when you get distance afterwards. So again, there is no absolute answer to these things. You have to try and find your way out, your own way through these things. Okay. How do you forgive yourself for your past, and how do you forgive others and move forward? Okay? So to forgive yourself and to forgive others, one of the great things to do is to understand, as I mentioned before today, how conditioned we all are. We do things not because we are inherently bad or because we have inherently did something wrong in life. We do things very often because the external conditions are the way they are, or the conditions from the past life are the way they are. And when you understand that you have been conditioned into this and that you often done these things even though you probably didn't really wish to do something bad, then it becomes much easier to forgive. It wasn't really your choice, but you were trapped in a situation where it is very hard to do things otherwise. The reason why you can't forgive is often because you feel responsible, right? I did this. I did something bad. But is it true that you did something bad? Or is it that you were trapped in a situation where you had very little choice? As long as you think you had a choice, as long as you think that you are responsible for whatever bad happened, then it will be hard to forgive you. But the more you understand that you are a subject to the circumstances, subject to all kinds of conditions, the more you understand that, the more you will be able to forgive yourself for what happened. And it's the same with the other person, right? The other person too is exactly like you, subject to all kinds of conditions and problems. So understand that. Again, to understand all is to forgive all, right? It's a beautiful saying. To understand all is to forgive all. So remember that. When you understand all, you can forgive anyone, including yourself. So that is the one way. The other thing that you will find is that forgiveness becomes easier if you live a good life. So if you are a good person in the here and now, and you practice goodness in your life, it boosts your sense of self-worth. It boosts your self-esteem, because you feel good about yourself, right? You just feel, yeah, I'm a good person. And the more natural goodness you feel about yourself, the easier it is to forgive yourself, because you can see the goodness is there. And when you can see the goodness, it's easier to forgive the slip-ups that we had in the past. So that is another part of it. Just make sure that you do what is good now. From now on, move in the right direction. And the further you move in the right direction, and the further along the road you go, you look back, it will be easier and easier to actually let go of those things in the past. Right? There's two things here. There's a beautiful simile in the suttas called the simile of the lump of salt. The idea of the lump of salt is that the lump of salt is a simile for all the bad actions you have done. If you put the lump of salt in the glass of water, the water in the glass is a simile for the amount of good actions you have done. Put the lump of salt in a glass of water, it becomes very salty and undrinkable. And that bad, undrinkable taste is like the severity of the results that come from those bad actions. In other words, you have to feel a lot of pain as a result of the bad actions. However, if you take exactly the same lump of salt, exactly the same amount of bad actions, and instead you dissolve them in a pond of water or even a lake of water, you can barely taste the salt at all. And here, in other words, if you do a large amount of good actions, then the same amount of bad actions hardly affect you at all, if at all. Right? So this is the thing. As we move and start doing the good things, the past becomes irrelevant, and you start to be able to forgive yourself. So there are two things for you to do, and so try that and see what happens. And if it doesn't work, come back next year and ask again. Okay. Oh, it's already 9 o'clock. Okay, so I might have to go a little bit faster. So, to be a vegetarian or not to be a vegetarian, okay? Very good question, and I think it's an important question. I think it's great to be a vegetarian. So if you want to be a vegetarian, wonderful. I support you 100%. I think that there is so much bad things happening to animals in our world. There's so much negative things happening with the way the whole meat industry is functioning that I don't really, I don't feel like supporting that industry. So I find it's quite nice to be vegetarian. But it's not, and I think this is important, it's not an absolute requirement from a Buddhist point of view. So please don't judge others. Do it because you do it out of compassion. Do it because you feel good about doing it. And then it becomes something pure and beautiful. It becomes an enhancement of your own compassion in a sense. If you do it because you are like an activist who wants to change other people, it's so easy to get into the fault-finding mind and finding fault with others. And then you destroy the compassion and kindness that comes out of being vegetarian. So be careful. I've seen too many vegetarians who are kind of have the activist mind, and there's often too much anger there and too much desire to convert everyone else, and that always leads to problems. So do it for yourself if you feel it's a beautiful thing to do. I will support you 100%. I'm vegetarian pretty much myself these days. Occasionally I eat a bit of fish. Don't take any meat, haven't taken meat for many months. But I did eat meat until quite recently, I have to confess. But not anymore. And I think it's a wonderful thing to do. I actually feel better for it myself. Okay, that is vegetarianism. Rather than our lives are like a ship without a rudder, surely we can use our willpower to change our destiny. Okay, yes, you can change your willpower to change your destiny, usually for the worse. No, I'm being naughty. I'm being naughty there. Willpower. The point about meditation, if you want to be really happy and you want to be really relaxed, try to avoid using too much willpower. It's true that you can use willpower, but remember where willpower comes from. Willpower itself is conditioned, right? Where does your will come from? Try to look at your will, try to look at your decisions in life, try to see where they come from, and you will see that basically it is conditioned by all kinds of things. When you decide something, why do you decide it? When you decide what to have for breakfast, it's probably because you like something more than something else. It's craving that is driving your will, right? And that is very often the case. So look at the conditioning of the will, where it's coming from. So if your will is conditioned in the right way, then you will be practicing the Buddhist path. And this is why the Kalyanamitta is so important, because the Kalyanamitta is the thing that conditions your will. Once you have a good Kalyanamitta, you understand the Buddhist path, then that will condition your will to drive your will in the right direction. And then the will becomes your friend because it takes you in the right way. If you don't have the Kalyanamitta, if you're conditioned by the wrong people, then your will be conditioned by the wrong things and you will go in the wrong direction, right? So again, the will is conditioned. It's not just the will is some kind of independent entity that stands apart from everything else, which kind of shows you the right way. Will itself is conditioned. So this is why we are like rudderless ships. Part of that ship is will, right? That will itself is what is being moved along around the oceans, like with the winds, in a sense. Okay, hope that makes sense. If not, come back next time. Okay, first precept. I keep a clean household to discourage pests with a catch and release program, okay, for some, that is a very nice program, isn't it? Catch and release program for some insects. I like the way you put that. However, redback spiders in the guests area, I was almost bitten once, and cockroaches in the kitchen present a dilemma. Is this just the unavoidable karma of a layperson? What happens at the monastery? Surely you don't let infestations run unchecked. Okay. I have lots of redbacks in my kuti, and usually the redback spiders are quite friendly. You just have to be a little bit careful how you deal with them. They are much more afraid of you than you are of them. They always run away when they see me anyway. They don't seem to like me all that much. So I usually catch them. I have a little stick, and I catch the redback spider, and I carry it off into the forest, and then drop it off somewhere in the forest. Or if you have the redback is sitting on the wall, you can catch it in the box, and then you use a sheet of paper to catch it inside. You can carry it out. They're not that dangerous, you know. They're pretty. If you are careful, it's not that difficult even to handle redback spiders. I handle redback spiders all the time without any problems whatsoever, because there's heaps of them in the forest. Cockroaches in the kitchen present a dilemma. Yes. Again, usually cockroaches are quite easy to catch. If you have a dustpan and a broom, you can sort of broom them up and you can sort of, again, take them away quite easily in my experience. Throw them out into the garden or something like that. It's not that difficult, again, in my experience. So try these things. I think that these things are things you can overcome. Yes, there may be certain situations where there actually really is no choice. And there are, even in monasteries, I think most monasteries have situations where killing of insects have happened because it just is impossible, you can't avoid it. So sometimes that happens. And we had one occasion in our monastery, Bodhinyana monastery, after in my 20 years there, where the inspectors from the Shire, they came up and they saw some cockroaches in our kitchen, and we weren't really able to get them all out, and it was basically impossible. And they said that unless you actually spray and do something about this, we're going to have to close down the kitchen. So that was one of those circumstances where basically we had no choice in the monastery. And then, basically we tried everything. I mean, we changed the whole kitchen to get rid of the cockroaches, and it still didn't really work out. So in the end, that is the way we had to go with that particular thing. So you avoid it as much as you can, and remember that karma is about intention, right? So if you do your very best to avoid, and then as a last kind of resort, because it is impossible to deal with it and you can't get away from it, then you end up killing some insects. Well, then the karma isn't that bad after all, because at least you have done your very best. And your intention, you're not doing it out of anger, you're not doing it out of desire, you're doing it out of a sense of desperation that there is no other way out. So it's not so bad. So sometimes you have to perhaps accept a little bit of bad karma because of these things. And also remember that karma is not really black and white. It's not either bad or good, right? It's often gray because our intentions aren't clear. Intention isn't usually either completely dark or completely beautiful. Often intention is somewhere in the middle. And because it is somewhere in the middle, it often leads to somewhere in the middle results as a consequence. So you do your best, and life sometimes, unfortunately, is not perfect. Okay, how do I slow down my busy mind to reach the nothingness, peace, and pleasure of relaxation? Okay, so how do you slow down your busy mind and reach these kind of things? Okay, so the first thing to try to do, and that is one of the things I was trying to teach here, is to learn how to be an observer, learn how to be passive, learn just to be aware. Because one of the main reasons why your mind is so busy is because there's so much willpower in there driving your thinking mind around. And that willpower is your enemy. Remember here that when you are passive, when you're just observing, in other words, when you are accepting whatever is going on, that is the exact opposite of willpower, right? Acceptance is the opposite of doing. Doing means getting involved, doing stuff. Here you are accepting, and by accepting, that in itself is an undermining of that busy mind. So try that. Try to learn to accept yourself as you are. Stand back, just feel that busy mind, and learn just to observe it for what it is. And it's not easy. Often you get kind of carried away by the stream of thought. You know what it's like, suddenly you think, wait, where have I been for the last, I don't even know how long it is, the last 2 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever. And you've been carried away in this fantasy, completely unaware what was actually going on. And suddenly you catch yourself, right? Now that is exactly not what I mean by observing yourself. Standing back means being able to see these things happen. So you catch yourself. And then when you catch yourself, you just relax into the moment again, and you start observing again. No force, no will is required, just observing. So this is the first thing, how to calm the busy mind. But also remember that the reason why the mind is busy is because the mind wants to be busy. Why does the mind want to be busy? Because it doesn't have enough happiness in the present moment, right? This is what I've been talking about at the very beginning of this retreat. Meditation works when you have a pure heart, when you have a lot of goodness inside of you. Because when you have goodness inside of you, you feel happy here. Happiness brings your mind automatically into the present moment. It doesn't want to escape anymore. If you feel good about yourself, why on earth would you want to be somewhere else? Why on earth would the mind want to be restless? It doesn't want that anymore. So it means that you have to try harder to develop those good qualities, the goodness in life that brings the mind into the present moment. And you will be so happy for it. If you do that, you will feel so happy for it afterwards, because you will feel the beauty of having that mindfulness and having this good feel about yourself. So try those two things. The long-term solution is to become basically to purify yourself. See what you can do with your virtue. See how you can purify your mind. Do more metta meditation. Try to overcome your anger and irritations. All of these things, more purity. That's the long-term solution. The short-term solution is to learn to sit back and watch what's happening here. Okay, dear Ajahn, what is a nimitta? Please explain. Thank you. Just for your information, it's 9:15 now. I've gone a bit over the time, so if any of you feel like you want to leave or anything like that, please do so. Don't feel shy about that. Otherwise, I will probably go on till I finish these questions. It shouldn't be that much longer here. So, dear Ajahn, what is a nimitta? Please explain. So, the word nimitta means something like characteristic in the Pali language, or it means like a sign or a mark, or perhaps even like an object or something that you see inside in your mind. It is often used of any kind of vision that you have in the mind as meditation becomes more deep. Often any kind of vision is called a nimitta. But there is a particular type of vision that is the vision you want to try to move towards in Buddhism. And that is the vision that comes from a very peaceful and happy mind. And this is a vision. Often it is felt as a light, beautiful light inside of you, a light that is full of happiness, full of peace, and full of beauty. That is the kind of vision that you're trying to ultimately try and want to move towards. So that is often the meaning of this word nimitta, any kind of mental image inside, but specifically that image, which is a beautiful light in the mind. Don't try to get nimittas. Sometimes people think that they should get the nimittas. No, never try to get anything. If you try to get nimittas, you will get incredibly frustrated. These are not things you get. These are things that result from the right kind of practice. So practice in the right way, and then eventually these things will happen. Don't try to go after them. Don't try to get samadhi. Don't try to get jhanas. Don't try to get peace. Don't try anything. Just try. Just do the basic instruction of just sitting down and being at ease in your body, trying to be a passive observer, right? Having the right attitude. This is the stuff you do. Don't try to get any particular result. Put in the causes and the result will happen. Focus on the causes, never on the results. Focus on the results, that's just called craving, and will lead you away from the goal of the practice. Okay, so if we are good, does that automatically mean we will have a good rebirth, even without monks, nuns praying for us for the first 3 weeks after our death to help us traverse the bardos of becoming, so we do not have a rebirth in the lower realms? Indeed, you don't need any monks or nuns to pray for you. Isn't that a wonderful thing? Forget about the monks and the nuns praying. Actually, we don't pray anyway, so it's not going to be much use for you. Praying is people think that Buddhists pray, but maybe some Buddhists pray, but I certainly don't pray. There's nobody to pray to, so why would I pray here? So the idea of Buddhists, what we often call praying, is just chanting, right? We do a bit of chanting and all these kind of things, and you do chanting to sort of people feel happy. There is a few things you can do when somebody dies. You can ask for forgiveness, and you can give forgiveness, and you can send some metta and wish the person well. And often that will be all you have to do, and then they will move in the right direction. But doesn't matter if the monks do it or whoever does it. Often it's more important that the person who are close to them does it, like a family member, because that's where the attachment is. And attachment is what you want to release so you can move on into the future. But quite rightly, if you are good, that is what matters, right? Just be good. If you are good, then you have everything it takes to move on into the future in a good way. So don't worry so much. Sometimes in Buddhism you will hear a lot about the death moment being so important. There isn't really anything about that in the suttas. It may be a little bit important, but it's only marginal. What really matters is how you live your life here and now. If that is done well, you will move in a good direction in the future. You are responsible. Nobody can help you if you live a dodgy life and you are a dodgy person with dodgy character. Then you will go to a dodgy rebirth. Don't recommend that. Okay, so that is the way. What's the difference between the meditation of the Buddhist and an agnostic? Okay, probably not much. Probably can be roughly the same. I mean, an agnostic means someone who doesn't know. I think all Buddhists are to some extent agnostics as well. This is one of the things about the Buddhist teaching I like, is that we accept that we don't know, right? If you ask me, do I believe in rebirth? I think on balance that there is rebirth, but I also recognize I don't know that there is rebirth. So because I don't know, I'm open for the possibility that I might not be, right? Which means that to some extent I'm an agnostic about those things. So there's nothing in Buddhism where you have to say, oh, I believe in rebirth, and then you become a Buddhist. It's just that you recognize that there is a certain degree of uncertainty there. And that is good to recognize that. It's important to recognize that. So there is an agnostic element in all of Buddhism, in my opinion. So the meditation is basically the same, right? You meditate. Of course, it can be very useful to have a sense of confidence in the Buddha's teachings. If you have a sense of confidence that these things actually work, it may actually empower your meditation. So confidence, sometimes translated as faith, can be a very powerful and very useful thing. And that is why I recommend anyone who has some spiritual interest or spiritual inclination, try to read the word of the Buddha and see what happens. And you may actually find it very powerful and very useful. And when you get that sense of confidence in these teachings, it will become something very useful on the Buddhist path. It will give you a sense of energy because you feel, wow, there's something really to be done here. There's something which actually works, right? If someone tells you that there are deep states of meditation called jhanas or nimittas or whatever, okay, you don't really know, so you're going to have to be agnostic about that. But if you read the suttas and it seems real, if you listen to Ajahn Brahm and you listen to the way he describes deep meditation, it certainly sounds real, then you gain confidence that these things actually exist, right? And that helps you to drive your meditation practice because you know that there's something there that is beautiful and really worthwhile having in life. So agnosticism is good to some extent. Confidence is also good to some extent. So just do what is natural. Don't force yourself one way or the other. Allow things to come naturally. You can't force yourself to be Buddhist anyway. It has to be a natural feeling. And then I think that is the best way of doing things. Okay, who or what is the Buddha now? Okay, so who or what is the Buddha now? What do you think? So the Buddha, the thing about a Buddha is that the purpose of the Buddhist path is to avoid getting reborn in the future, right? That is the purpose of the Buddhist path, ultimately. Why is that the purpose? Because as long as you get reborn, there's going to be suffering. There's going to be problems, endless problems, right? And for every rebirth, you keep doing the same stupid mistake you did in your last life. I think if we saw a kind of a movie of all our lives, seeing us doing this exactly the same stupid mistakes every time, you'd feel completely, enough. I can't take this anymore. I don't want to see that. And this is kind of the power in Buddhism of actually understanding the idea of past lives. You get this sense of, oh, this is just too much. I don't want to do this anymore. It's terrible, right? And that is what the Buddha ends. He makes an end of that sequence of just going around doing the same stupid thing, the same stupid mistakes, life after life after life. So he's not reborn. So where is he if he's not reborn? He's not here anymore, right? That's what it means. He's gone. He's disappeared. He has attained the highest happiness, which is called Nibbana. The highest happiness is not to be reborn. That's the best way to look at it. It's just the highest happiness. It doesn't matter what it is. If you get the highest happiness, that's good enough for me, right? I'm going to go for the highest happiness. That is what has happened to the Buddha. He has attained to precisely that. Okay. So, I am not a faith kind of person. Is it necessary? I'm more into examining with the wisdom, cause and effect. I get turned off by the hocus pocus of religion. Will I be okay in this path? Will I be okay in this path? Okay, you don't like the hocus pocus of religion? Okay, fair enough. I would tend to agree. I don't like it myself. Maybe we have different ideas of hocus and pocus, but anyway, one of the interesting questions that often is asked is Buddhism a religion, right? Is it a religion? And I think that is an open question. Some people say it is, some people say it isn't. For me, Buddhism is a path to happiness, is a path away from suffering, is a path of fulfillment, a path of filling in that hole in yourself called craving, which is never satisfied, and suddenly finding real satisfaction in life. That's what Buddhism is really about. Is that a religion? Perhaps it can be looked at that way, but to me it's just common sense, right? Who doesn't want that? I mean, anybody would want that, surely, whether you're religious or not. So perhaps it's not a religion. Some people certainly act as if Buddhism is a religion. They treat it as a religion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Buddha, his teaching, are religious teachings in the same way. So it really depends on how you look at it. It's a very complex question here. I'm not a faith kind of person. I'm more into examining with wisdom, cause and effect. Good, please do so. That's a very important part of the Buddha's teaching, to examine things with wisdom, to understand cause and effect. In particularly, if you're trying to purify yourself, try to understand why things arise. Why is it that you end up doing things which are impure? Why is it that you end up breaking the precepts, doing immoral things? Why is it that you think thoughts you probably shouldn't have? Examine that in particular. That is the most important thing, because then, by understanding the causality in that sphere, you will actually be able to purify yourself. And then you get this wonderful mind, which is very bright and brilliant, and you can actually see things much more deeply from that point of view. Is faith necessary? Faith? Let's call it confidence rather than faith, because it's a bit like you read the suttas and you think, wow, this is so true, this makes sense, and you gain confidence in the suttas. Perhaps you can call it faith, but I prefer confidence. Is it necessary? It's very useful, it's very powerful, and it's something that can take you a very long way on the path. If you have confidence, you get the energy, right? If you get the energy, the practice happens so much better than without it. How do you get that confidence? Again, by reading the word of the Buddha. And if you can relate to the word of the Buddha, if it works for you, if it makes sense for you, then the confidence happens all by itself. If it doesn't make any sense to you, well then, fine, at least you know it doesn't make any sense to you. Okay, dear Ajahn Brahmali, the most success I have had when meditating is when I think about holding my baby and the love I felt for her. Then I try to keep that wonderful feeling of love and imagine sharing it with all the world. Is this a metta meditation? Thank you, from a beginner. Okay? Yes, I think that a baby is not a bad object of metta, because a baby is something that you don't really expect that much in return from, right? A baby is something which doesn't really do very much. It's almost just like this person who doesn't really it's a reasonably pure form of love. But it's not entirely pure, because it's your baby, right? And there's obviously very likely to be some degree of attachment there with that baby. So it's a good way to start, but ideally, eventually, you would like to move also beyond that. Move to a type of metta that is even more pure, a type of metta where there is no attachment and no clinging or holding on whatsoever. That's the ideal thing. But certainly in the Metta Sutta that we chanted this morning, we talked about the mother's love for her child, right? Just as having metta, just as a mother has for her only child. And of course, there is some truth to that. And the thing there, I think the important thing there is that a mother for her child, maybe especially her baby, is that you're often willing to forgive your child anything because they are your child. No matter what they do, you will tend to forgive them, right? And that attitude, the willingness to forgive somebody regardless, the ability to always see the good thing in your child, that is what this metta here is about. So that is what you should try to do in metta meditation, having the same understanding for all people as you have for your child. This feeling that there is something there, something beautiful there. I can always forgive the negative sides. Okay, I'm feeling a little bit tired now, so I'm going a little bit faster here. So, hello again, okay? What's with the funny teddies, okay? Gorgeous they are, okay? Okay, good. I don't know, I guess it's just to make you feel good. So if it makes you feel good, if you say they're gorgeous, it must be working. So I say it is working, doing its magic. The idea is just to feel a bit soft, right? So you have the softness is your co-teacher. So that is the nice thing. You feel more soft when you have a teddy there. So the soft heart is the one that is able to go into meditation, not the hard heart. So you want to use whatever that makes you feel soft. So if your teddy makes you feel soft, use a teddy to make you feel more soft. That's kind of the idea behind that. I didn't actually put it there, but I think it's very nice. It's a beautiful little teddy. It's like a polar bear teddy in white. Okay, next one. Sometimes when I'm meditating at the point of jhana, I become nervous, scared. How can we let go to fully experience the meditation? Okay, so if you are getting into deep meditation and you're starting to feel that your mind is becoming very peaceful and very beautiful and all of these wonderful things are happening, basically in these kind of situations you just have to learn to stay with that and just stay there. If you're going too far, then go back to a slightly earlier stage and just stay there for a long period of time. Allow the development to happen very slowly. And if it happens very slowly, you learn to be comfortable with this. It's like any experience in life, right? It's like the dangerous animals we were talking about before. Initially, I was a bit scared of the redbacks because you hear all these scare stories. And the story is always the worst. Reality is always much less scary than the stories. So then you get used to the redbacks, and after a while, they're not a problem anymore. And it's the same thing with these deep states of meditation. You just gradually learn to deal with them. You gradually learn to be with them. And as you learn that, eventually it becomes natural. It becomes a habit, and it's not scary anymore. So just go slowly. Don't try to do anything. Don't try to go any further. Stay where you are and move very, very gradually, and then you'll be okay. Okay. I recently saw a TV program that said that sitting constantly is bad for your health. So where does that leave us meditators? What are your thoughts on this? Thank you. Do more walking meditation and do other things, right? Don't just sit on your bottom all the time. Do other types of meditation practice. Walking meditation, it's very well known that in the forest tradition in Thailand, and I think the forest tradition elsewhere, walking meditation was a very important part of the meditation practice. So do walking. Go for a walk in the forest even if you want to do that. Don't just sit here all the time. It's a wonderful thing to do. And you can achieve a lot by doing walking meditation. You can do all kinds of contemplation and understandings during your walking meditation. Okay, last question for today here. Thank you. Other teachings declare Buddhism is not a religion, rather a way of being. Could you please clarify religion or not religion? Okay, I think we just talked about that before. I think it's a very hard question to give any final answer to, whether it is a religion or not. I sometimes like to think of it as not of a religion, simply because religion often has a bad name, right? People don't really want to be religious these days, and fair enough, I can sort of understand that. So because we are quite different from other religions, because we look at the world in a very different way, I think it's fair enough to say that we're not a religion. And I kind of like that, not having that label of religion on us. It is certainly, it has some aspects that are religious. One of the aspects that is perhaps a little bit religious in Buddhism is that we have this idea of a kind of final goal, right, called Nibbana. And this seems to be a kind of religious thing, that there is such a final goal. That is not normally what you have in ordinary life. So that makes it perhaps a little bit religious. On the other hand, we don't have the idea of anything from the outside, kind of coming into nature and kind of sorting things out, like this idea of a God, which is outside of nature and interfering in the process of things. There's no such thing in Buddhism. The Buddhist idea is much more the idea that everything is part of nature. We are part of nature, everything is part of nature. So in that sense, again, Buddhism is not really a religion. So again, it all depends on how you want to look at these things. Personally, I like the idea of Buddhism not being a religion, but it's still an open question. Okay, so that was the last question for tonight.